Hi again. So, born in 1942 in Texas to a Spanish speaking Chicano family, Gloria Anzaladua was a pioneer in the 1970s of Chicano and Chicana studies and literature. Chicana and Chicano are US Americans with a Mexican background. Since the origin of the word is Spanish, and Spanish is a gendered language, we need to use the a ending, chicana, to talk about girls and women. Sometimes people use an X at the end to include all genders. Unlike many other Spanish speaking minorities in the US, like Puerto Ricans or Cubans, Chicanos are not always immigrants, but often are descendants of people who have lived in areas of the southern US while those were still under Mexican control. During the 19th century, the US basically invaded and conquered large parts of Mexico, and those parts are still in the US. It's important to know also that unlike the situation in English speaking parts of North America, there was much more mixing with the native population and European colonists in Mexico. Thus, many Chicanos and Chicanas are descendants of Native Americans. They are therefore not thought of as white. I think today you are better off using the term Mexican American rather than Chicano. But Anzaladua uses Chicana and Chicano. Another word she uses to describe her identity, including in the title of the book from which we are reading an excerpt, is Mestiza, which signifies in Spanish being of mixed race, that is to say, both European and Native American, sometimes even African, but it can mean a mix of American and Mexican identities. She calls it a borderland identity. Many of the Chicanos live in the border areas between US and Mexico, in the south of Texas, in Arizona, in New Mexico. And Anzaladua and other Mexican American writers use this notion of borderlands, of in-between lands, to talk about their double and complex identities. And Anzaladua, especially in this section that we're reading, connects this borderland identity, this mestiza identity, to the use of many languages, as we'll see through a close reading of her essay. Anzaladua was a scholar, a writer, and an activist. I'll mention that she was a lesbian and a feminist activist. Those identities surely affected her way of thinking, but will not be our focus today. She wrote several books of non-fiction and poetry and edited a number of important collections. She also wrote children's books, and she died in 2004. The essay that we are reading is from her most impactful, famous book, Borderlands, La Frontera, The New Mestiza, a collection of autobiographical, narrative, theoretical thoughts, and even poems. You'll note the code switching even in the title. Frontera is the word in Spanish, as you can guess, for border or frontier. So she has Borderlands and La Frontera in the same title. We will read this section that, by the way, often read on its own and not part of the book as a whole, in a double way as well. We will read it to gather ideas about the language use, like we would read an academic paper, but we will also try to read it closely like a short story or a poem, and not so different from how I approached Du Bois's essay. Let's get to the essay itself. You'll notice she begins with a personal anecdote, which she describes through words that have more than one meaning. We're going to have to control your tongue, the dentist says, pulling out all of the metal from my mouth. Silver bits plop and tinkle into the basin. My mouth is a mother lode. It's like a great mine. The dentist, there's a lot in it. The dentist is cleaning out my roots. I get a whiff of the stench when I gasp. I can't clap that tooth yet. You're still draining, he says. We're going to have to do something about your tongue. I hear the anger rising in his voice. There's something about the tongue that makes the expert angry. My tongue keeps pushing out the wads of cotton, pushing back the drills. Like she can't even control her tongue, and the dentist can't control her tongue either. The long, thin needles. I've never seen anything as strong or as stubborn, he says. I think, how do you tame a wild tongue? Train it to be quiet. How do you bridle and saddle it? How do you make it lie down? We have a kind of inciting incident here, a situation in her life that causes Anzaladua to think about her language, about her use of her tongue in speaking. She is at the dentist. He's trying to control her tongue. Her tongue is too powerful and uncontrollable for him to do the dental procedure that he needs to do to help her. The tongue is the organ of speech. It's often synonymous with language. This insistence causes Anzaladua to realize something about herself. Her tongue, her way of speaking, and her language is wild. Perhaps something in it that is wild in a way that sometimes hurts her. The rest of the excerpts will follow in what way her tongue is wild and how people have tried to control it, like the dentist does. Maybe you noticed another word that can have more than one meaning. That's the word I'm thinking about is roots. These are part of the teeth, the root canals, but also suggest that part of the issue here is where she comes from, her ethnic and national roots. Part of why her tongue is wild is because her roots are different from other people's roots. Her identity is different from other people's identity. Anyways, the double meaning of tongue, which is something you can't argue about, she does give the tongue a double meaning. Physical organ and language itself and speaking reminds us of the multiplicity of language. Language, she doesn't only speak two languages, even one word can have more than one meaning. This passage ends with questions. How do you tame a wild tongue? Train it to be quiet. How do we bridle and saddle it? Like you need to do with a wild horse, you have to bridle and saddle it. And horses, of course, are part of the environment in Texas. How do you make it lie down so you can do the dentistry work, but also so you stop hurting yourself maybe with this wild tongue? Does she ask it as if she wants to know how to do it, or does she ask this question in order to understand what has been done to her? How people caused her tongue to be controlled. The next quote comes out of nowhere, but shows us that indeed this taming of a wild tongue is a violent act. Who is to say that robbing a people of its language is less violent than war? Taming a language, taming the tongue, is equated here with robbing and silencing a language, of doing violence to the language. The quote here says that it may be just as violent as war. It is like taking away life. It's like taking away freedom. And we know that often conquest and war go hand in hand with silencing languages and destroying languages. For instance, the murder of Jews in the Holocaust has a huge role in the demise of Yiddish, and the English conquest of Ireland is a very important reason why few people speak Gaelic Irish today. This quote bring to mind childhood memories. As I read, ask yourself, what does this memory have to do with the issue at hand? What does it have to do with the quieting and taming of language? I remember being caught speaking Spanish at recess. That was good for 3 licks on the knuckles, 3 hits on the knuckles with a sharp ruler. I remember being sent to the corner of the classroom for talking back to the Anglo teacher, to the English-speaking teacher, when all I was trying to do was tell her how to pronounce my name. If you want to be American, speak American. If you don't like it, go back to Mexico, where you belong. Anzaladua remembers from her childhood in the 1940s and 50s how teachers policed her language use with violence, actually hurting her for speaking her mother tongue. She is being seen as rude just because she wants the teacher to pronounce her name correctly. Language is used to police identity and borders. In the US, you must speak like an American, i.e., speak American, not Spanish. If you want to speak Spanish, go to the other side of the border. You can be part of society if you give up your language, and probably along with your language, give up your identity. But even as a young child, Anzaladua refused to do that. She also refuses to give up on Spanish as a writer, and even in a book that is mostly in English, there's a lot of Spanish. So if you don't really speak Spanish, you don't understand everything that's written there. Like when she quotes her mother's admonitions to her and forgive my bad Spanish, of course, as I read this. And when she was young, her mother would say, I want you to speak English. Palar buen trabajo tienes que saber hablar el inglés bien. ¿Qué vale toda tu educación si todavía hablas inglés con un accent? My mother would say, mortified, scared that I spoke English like a Mexican. Her mother wants her to succeed in English education, in learning English, to succeed in the English educated world. She wants her to speak proper English. Therefore, she also admonishes her and scolds her, even though her mother is Spanish speaking and she speaks with her in Spanish. She tells her, speak English like the Americans, not with an accent. She says, what is all your education good for if you're going to speak with an accent? I want you to pretend not to be Mexican when you're speaking English. She does that in Spanish mixed with English. You noticed the last word of the quote in Spanish is the English word accent. But she's, even her mother, as she's speaking Spanish, tells her not to sound as if she's a Spanish speaker. So of course she does this in her own language, the language she speaks at home, Mexican Spanish, but notice that even this is not pure Spanish. No, it's a mix. The mother speaks in one sentence in English as well. She moves to Spanish, then ends with one English word accent, probably spoken with an accent itself. Probably she says the word accent with an accent. And Anzaladua shows us that her mother's language, her mother tongue is not Spanish. It's this mixed language. Being Chicana means growing up with code switching as your mother tongue, with double identity as your main identity. A mixing of languages, and therefore an insistence in the way the text looks on her complex Mestiza identity, her borderland identity, is the wild tongue she speaks of at the beginning. And she comes to a conclusion. Wild tongues cannot be tamed. They can only be cut out. Right? This wildness, you can't destroy it, you can't tame it, you can't control it unless you're going to destroy it. And it's and preventing her from speaking like she wants to is doing violence to her. That's what she's insisting on. You're not changing them, you're just shutting them up. This issue has feminist as well as ethnic dimensions, because it's often women who are told to stay quiet because they do not speak or as expected, or they speak too much. But it also has this dimension of trying to speak Spanish in the English-speaking United States. It's interesting that she does not only blame the English-speaking dominant society for curtailing her speech, for shutting her up, she blames speakers of other variants of Spanish as well. Even Spanish speakers don't always like her mixed language, her mixed identity. Even our own people, other Spanish speakers, Nos quieren ponder candidos en la boca, they would hold us back with their bag of regalas de academia, with academic rules of the language. Like Hebrew has Academia Lelashon Ivrit, Spanish has the Spanish language Academia. Pocho, cultural traitor, you're speaking the oppressor's language by speaking English. You're ruining the Spanish language. This is things Spanish people tell her when she speaks this mix of English and Spanish. She's ruining the Spanish language. She's betraying her people by speaking English, the language of the oppressor, the language of the people who took over parts of Mexico and treat Mexicans badly. She's giving up by speaking any English. But for her, that's part of her language, that's part of her wild tongue, to speak both English and Spanish. I have been accused by various Latinos and Latinas. Chicano Spanish is considered by the purists and by most Latinos deficient, not enough, a mutilation of Spanish. So even Spanish speakers are not happy with the way she speaks and think of her as speaking some kind of lesser language. Shows she speaks a mixture and therefore is accused of being a bad version of a Latina. Her identity is not pure enough because her language is not pure enough. She's called a traitor. Somebody who's given in to the US American English culture. But Anzaladua thinks these accusations are unfair. Her language is not bad Spanish, and it's not bad English. It's an entity of its own. It's a hybrid or border language that has its own border identity and its own right to exist as a language. She explains, but Chicano Spanish is a border tongue which developed naturally. Change, evolution, have created variants of Chicano Spanish. Un nuevo lenguaje, a new language. Un lenguaje que corresponde a un modo de viver. It's a new language that corresponds, that connects to a specific way of life on the border. Chicano Spanish is not incorrect, she explains. It's not wrong, just like African American English is not English with mistakes in it. It is its own English. Chicano Spanish is not incorrect. It is a living language. for a people who are neither Spanish nor live in a country which Spanish is the first language, for a people who live in a country in which English is the reigning tongue, but who are not Anglo, for people who cannot entirely identify with either standard, formal Castilian Spanish, nor standard English. So neither of them, standard Spanish as it's spoken in Spain and standard English as it is spoken in the US or in England, neither belong to the Chicanos. So they have their own language, which is a mixture of both. What recourse is left to them but to create their own language? Because we don't identify with either language, we create our own language. That's what she's saying. A language which they can connect their identity to. One capable of communicating their realities and values true to themselves. A language with terms that are neither Espanol ni Inglés, so neither Spanish or English, but both. It's a new language for being situated between the English-speaking world and the Spanish-speaking world. We speak a patois, a forked tongue, right? A tongue with two identities, but it's also supposed to remind you of a snake, perhaps, that has a forked tongue. Maybe this forked tongue seems dangerous to some people. A variation of two languages. Notice how language and identity are connected here. The language you use is who you are. It's an expression of the reality you live in. And when you live on the border or near the border, when you have a mixed identity, your language will have the same quality. It's going to be a mixture of language. It's going to have constant code switching, or even maybe not fair to call it code switching, just a new language that draws terms and draws ideas and words from both languages, asking you not to code switch, or actually not to speak in the language that combines two codes into a new code, is like asking you to be someone else. Telling her to speak standard English or telling her to speak standard Spanish is like erasing her identity. This explains why this text combines the different languages, right? She couldn't have written it just in Spanish or just in English, because the text is supposed to express who she is, so it has to be in both languages, even though it's difficult for me to teach it for that reason and for you to read it for that reason. If the text was not in a mixture, it would not be a good expression of who Anzaladua is, and it wouldn't be a good expression of the people she's trying to represent.